This area is currently restricted.
I am the chief medical officer. We have an emergency inside.
I don't care who you are.
There is a child in there whose heart is stopping.
Again,
Move out of my way.
If you take one more step, I will restrain you immediately.
You're arresting a doctor during a resuscitation attack?
No!
At 6:20 a.m. on a Wednesday morning at St. Mary's Medical Center in Los Angeles, security guard David Coleman made the single biggest mistake of his career. He stopped a black woman dressed in scrubs and demanded to see her identification. He had no idea that the woman standing before him was not just a physician, but Dr. Vive, Sarah Jenkins, the hospital's chief medical officer, a member of the board of directors, and quite simply, one of the people who signed his paychecks. The surveillance footage of this encounter would later be reviewed repeatedly by the hospital board and labor lawyers, eventually becoming a mandatory case study for security training in healthcare facilities across several states. In a matter of 15 minutes, David's career reached its end. 7 months later, the hospital paid $920, Zakshing 1983, to reach a settlement. And within a year, security contracts at more than 20 hospitals were overhauled, all originating from a morning that hadn't even fully begun. At that moment, however, standing in the hallway outside the intensive care unit ICU, David was oblivious to what was coming. He simply felt the woman had a bad attitude and was shocked that she dared to question him. He would soon learn some people appear assertive because they are exhausted from being treated as suspicious in the very places they belong. Dr. V. Sarah Jenkins was no ordinary 46-year-old. While most doctors her age are specializing in a niche or striving to become department heads, Sarah was already overseeing the medical operations of the entire hospital. More remarkably, she didn't just climb a management ladder before transitioning to administration. She was a Stanford-educated cardiothoracic surgeon who had performed over 500 open-door SART surgeries. She also held master's degrees in public health and business administration, had published 19 papers in prestigious medical journals, and her research on reducing surgical complications for minority patients had been adopted as a standard protocol by hospitals across the nation. As Chief Medical Officer (CMO), Sarah was responsible for supervising all clinical departments, every medical decision, and every doctor, nurse, and healthcare worker. The hospital treats over 180 patients annually, and she managed a team of nearly 900 physicians with a clinical budget of $420 million. On medical matters, the board of directors reported to her. When the CEO made strategic decisions, they sought her counsel. By any measure, she was one of the most influential people in the building. She was also one of only a dozen or so black female CMOs at large hospitals in the United States. Throughout her career, she had constantly faced questions about her identity. There was always someone whose subconscious told them she shouldn't be here. That Wednesday, Sarah had arrived at the hospital at 4:45 a.m. A multi-minute vehicle up on the interstate had sent 8 critically injured patients to the ER simultaneously. She had been in the trauma zone coordinating rescues, guiding surgical teams, and making life or death decisions. Now, she was wearing blood-stained scrubs, her surgical cap pushed to the back of her head, and her ID badge clipped to her waist, partially hidden by her clothing. She was tired, running on nothing but coffee and adrenaline, on her way to the ICU to check on a patient they had just saved. She had walked this hallway thousands of times and knew every nurse, most of the janitorial staff, and, she thought, all the daytime security guards. David Coleman was new, having been on the job for only a month. The security firm that employed him had provided only 3 days of training, focusing mostly on post locations and shift schedules. No one had briefed him on the hospital leadership. No one had shown him a photo of the CMO, and no one had explained that a doctor coming straight out of surgery might not have their badge prominently displayed. But David had his own judgment. He had a preconceived notion of what a doctor should look like and who belonged in restricted areas. As Sarah walked by, his internal bias told him she doesn't belong here. He called out to her, stating that the area was for medical personnel only. Sarah stopped and turned. This was a situation she knew all too well. At medical conferences, industry events, and even in her own hospital, she had faced the skepticism so many times that it was wearying. She calmly told David she was medical staff, her tone neutral, merely stating a fact. Instead of asking a follow-up question, David directly demanded to see her ID. Sarah didn't produce it immediately. Instead, she asked, "Is seeing my badge the only way you'll believe I work here?" The question cut to the core. Why did he doubt her? What made him feel she didn't fit the profile? David cited policy, stating that hospital rules required everyone to show valid ID in restricted areas. It sounded reasonable, but there was a fatal flaw. The rule wasn't being applied fairly. Sarah immediately pointed out that in the last few minutes, she had seen at least 5 people pass by without visible badges, and he hadn't stopped a single one of them. She asked David what the difference was between her and them. David didn't answer. Instead, he escalated the conflict. He questioned whether she was refusing to cooperate, attempting to shift the focus to her insubordination rather than his own selective enforcement. Sarah remained calm and asked again why she was the only one being stopped. The question hung in the air, and everyone watching understood the answer. Everyone, it seemed, except David. David then made another error. He said he didn't have time to waste and told Sarah to either show her badge, or he would call someone to escort her out. It was a threat, an attempt to use intimidation and the threat of public embarrassment to force her into submission. At that moment, Sarah revealed her identity. Go ahead. Call for backup. Call your supervisor. Call human resources. Because in 5 minutes, you're going to find out that the person you just threatened to remove is the chief medical officer of this hospital. The statement hit like a physical blow. In the surveillance footage, David's confidence vanished instantly, replaced first by confusion, then by fear. He tried to argue that he couldn't have known, but his tone had completely softened. Sarah did not back down. She told him she didn't need him to believe her. She needed him to perform his duties correctly, which included not racially profiling the doctors who work there. She used the term racial profiling clearly and directly, without euphemism, naming the problem for exactly what it was. At that moment, a nurse named Lisa stepped out of a patient room. She moved to greet Sarah but stopped when she saw David's expression. Lisa had worked with Sarah for 7 years. She asked if everything was all right. Sarah briefly explained the guard had stopped her, insisted on seeing ID, and clearly felt she didn't look like someone who belonged in a medical area. Lisa looked at David in disbelief. "You stopped doctors." "Jenkins?" The name meant nothing to David. He asked, "Who is Dr. Jenkins?" Lisa stared at him, stunned. "She is the chief medical officer. She runs the whole hospital." David's face went pale. The cameras caught the exact moment his expression drained of color. He began to stammer an apology, but Sarah cut him off. She asked for his name and his supervisor's contact information. David gave them with a trembling voice. Sarah took out her phone. "Michael, it's Sarah. Come to the 5th- floor ICU hallway immediately. We have an urgent situation." Michael Russell, the director of security at St. Mary's, had been with the hospital for 15 years. He arrived 4 minutes later and understood the scene instantly. Sarah in bloodied scrubs with her arms crossed, David looking terrified, and Lisa standing by as a witness. Sarah gave a calm, objective account of the events being stopped, the demand for ID, and the threat of removal when she questioned why she was being singled out. She also noted that David had allowed several people without visible badges to pass before stopping her. She stated that the only logical explanation for this selective enforcement was racial profiling. Michael turned to David and asked if it was true. David tried to defend himself, saying he was just following the badge policy. Michael asked if he had stopped anyone else in this hallway today. David hesitated and admitted he hadn't. When Michael asked why, David was silent. Michael told David to go to the security office and wait. In the footage, David can be seen walking away with his head down, the bluster of 10 minutes prior completely gone. Michael offered Sarah's sincere apology, not a perfunctory sorry, but a genuine one. He said the behavior was unacceptable and would be handled immediately. Sarah made it clear that this wasn't just about her. She had spent her entire career dealing with such slights, but she would not allow it to happen in her hospital, not to her, not to other minority physicians, and not to anyone. She gave Michael a directive to conduct a comprehensive audit of the security firm's training. Collect data on everyone stopped in restricted areas to see if there was a pattern. And have it all on her desk within 48 hours. Michael nodded. He knew this wasn't just a complaint from a frustrated doctor, but a serious directive from an executive who had been discriminated against in her own house. Sarah then went to see her patients. 6 people in the ICU needed her care. They didn't care about badge policies or security contracts. They just needed a doctor who could save their lives. She set the conflict aside to focus on her work, but she did not forget it. That evening, after an 18-hour shift, Sarah wrote a detailed incident report, every line of dialogue, every witness, the time, the place, and the specific details of the discrimination. She sent it to Michael Russell, with copies to the CEO, the head of HR, the chairman of the board, and her personal lawyer. She wasn't just filing a complaint. She was building a documented record witnessed by multiple parties that could not be easily dismissed or denied. The next morning, Michael's report revealed a disturbing pattern. In the past 4 weeks, David had stopped 15 people in restricted areas. 14 were minorities, and 10 were minority women. Only 1 was white, a young man with long hair and visible tattoos. The pattern was undeniable. David wasn't enforcing hospital policy. He was acting on his own bias regarding what medical staff should look like. Michael revoked David's access to the hospital and informed the security company they would no longer use him. But Sarah wasn't satisfied with just firing David. She wanted systemic change. She called a meeting with the CEO, the board chair, the HR director, and the regional manager of the security firm. At the meeting, she presented data she had requested from the IT department showing security stops in restricted areas over the past year. There was a glaring racial disparity. Black and Latino staff were 4 times more likely to be stopped and questioned than white staff, despite making up only 38% of the medical workforce. The data was irrefutable. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a systemic failure. The security company tried to defend its training. Sarah shut them down immediately. If your training produces guards who can recognize the chief medical officer and who engage in selective racial profiling, your training is worthless. She gave the company an ultimatum: either completely overhaul their training incorporating input from the hospital's diversity and inclusion team, implementing mandatory implicit bias training, and creating a clear protocol for badge checks, or their contract would be terminated. The company chose to comply. They couldn't afford to lose a major hospital contract. Within 2 weeks, a new training program was launched. Every guard had to complete 10 hours of implicit bias training. They were given a directory of hospital leadership photos, and they were taught how to verify identity politely without making assumptions based on appearance. But Sarah wasn't done. She consulted her attorney, who pointed out that while David was gone and training had changed, the hospital still bore responsibility for maintaining a discriminatory environment. The security company worked for the hospital, and the hospital had a duty of oversight. Sarah didn't want to sue her own institution, but she understood that organizations often don't take issues seriously until there is a financial cost. She filed a formal complaint with the EOC Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, alleging racial discrimination and a hostile work environment. She didn't just document the incident with David. She detailed a series of similar microaggressions she had faced during her 6 years as CMO, being questioned when trying to enter leadership meetings, being mistaken for janitorial or cafeteria staff, and having her authority repeatedly challenged in ways her white male colleagues never experienced. Everything was documented, witnessed, and tied to previous reports she had sent to HR. The hospital's lawyers saw the complaint and knew they were in trouble. Sarah wasn't an average employee they could dismiss. She was a CMO with an impeccable reputation and an airtight paper trail. If they went to court, a jury would see video of a black female doctor in bloodied scrubs being threatened with removal from her own hospital. Settlement negotiations moved quickly. The hospital didn't want the story in the news. They didn't want to be known as a place that discriminated against its own leaders, and they didn't want to lose the ability to recruit minority physicians. 7 months after the incident, a settlement was reached. The hospital paid Sarah $920. Zakshan 1983. More importantly, the The hospital agreed to comprehensive policy reforms, creating a chief diversity officer position reporting directly to the CEO, mandatory bias training for all employees, not just security, an independent committee to investigate discrimination complaints, and a commitment to diversify leadership with tracked metrics. Sarah used a portion of her settlement to establish a scholarship fund for minority students pursuing careers in healthcare administration. She wanted to help the next generation of medical leaders be more diverse so that people would stop defaulting to the assumption that a black woman in a hospital couldn't be a high-level professional. David never worked in security again. The record of his firing for discrimination made it difficult for him to find employment in the field. The security company now uses case as a what not to do example in their training. His 15-minute confrontation became a cautionary tale. But the real point is this: David was just one man, but he reflected a broader problem. The security firm hired him without sufficient training. The hospital contracted with a firm that didn't prioritize proper vetting. The system allowed this to happen. And it wasn't just Sarah who was affected. How many minority nurses, technicians, and junior doctors had been stopped and questioned? They didn't have the power to fight back. Data showed that in 1 year alone, there had been hundreds of such incidents. This is what Sarah meant by "it's not just about me." She wanted to create an environment where everyone could be treated based on their profession, without having to prove they belong. This story offers several key lessons. On the surface, it's about a guard profiling his boss and facing the consequences, but the deeper meaning goes further. First, documentation is everything. Sarah didn't just complain. She wrote a detailed record, pulled data, and gathered evidence. She created a narrative that was impossible to ignore. Without documentation, it's just one person's word against another's. With it, it's an undeniable fact. Second, patterns matter more than single incidents. One guard stopping one doctor can be dismissed as a misunderstanding, but data showing hundreds of discriminatory stops over a year proves a systemic failure. Sarah understood that fixing the system was more important than punishing the individual. Third, know your power and use it. As CMO, Sarah had institutional power, and she used it to the fullest. However, she didn't stop after David was fired. She used her position to force institutional change, ensuring that more than just one problem employee was removed. Fourth, financial consequences. Dr. Change. The $920. Section made Team 83. Our settlement made the board of directors pay attention. It forced them to invest resources into a real solution. It is the sad reality that institutions often only take problems seriously when they carry a price tag. Fifth, create opportunities for others. Sarah could have walked away with her settlement. Instead, she used it to fund a scholarship. She turned a personal negative experience into a force for the next generation. That is how you create lasting change. Per the settlement, the surveillance footage was never made public, but it is used in training. Security firms in the healthcare industry use it to show the consequences of making assumptions based on race rather than following protocol. The video also shows a crucial detail: Sarah never raised her voice. She wasn't angry or aggressive. She simply asked questions, pointed out contradictions, and asserted her authority when necessary. Her professionalism left no room for anyone to claim she was difficult or unreasonable. 4 years later, St. Mary's Medical Center has seen significant progress. Leadership is more diverse. Policies are clearer, training is better, and discrimination complaints have dropped by 65%. The hospital is now recognized as an industry leader in diversity and inclusion. But Sarah says the work is never finished. Progress isn't perfection. Incidents still happen, but the system is better equipped to handle them. David's life took a different path. After struggling for a while, he found a job in retail. About a year after the incident, he reached out to Sarah on a professional networking site to apologize. He said he had reflected on his biases and was trying to do better. Sarah never replied. She later told a colleague that while she appreciated the apology, she was under no obligation to forgive him or give him her time. She felt her energy was better spent on systemic change than on a personal story of redemption. Some may disagree with her choice, believing in the power of forgiveness, But Sarah's perspective is valid. Black women have spent far too much time managing the feelings of others. Sometimes, the right thing to do is to focus on yourself and your community. In the year following the incident, that security company lost to more hospital contracts. Word spread through the industry. No one wanted to risk a similar disaster. The company eventually folded, and a new firm took over, one that made diversity training and proper identity verification its top priority. This is the ripple effect of accountability. If the person facing discrimination has the resources, knowledge, and determination to push for change, and if the institution is willing to listen, a single wellness-handled incident can change an entire industry. Today, Sarah still works at Street Mary's and is being considered for the CEO position of an even larger hospital system. Her reputation in medical management is world-class, and she is a frequent keynote speaker on diversity, leadership, and creating inclusive cultures in healthcare. In her speeches, she always mentions that Wednesday morning with David, not because it was her worst experience it was, but because it was a perfect example of what many minority professionals face every day: being judged, being over-scrutinized, and being forced to prove they belong in the very places they have every right to be. She tells her audience that the goal isn't to punish every David in the world, but to build systems where a David's bias cannot become discriminatory action. Through proper training and clear protocols, we can prevent bias from affecting how people are treated. The goal is to make diversity more than just a buzzword, but a reality seen at every level of an organization. This story is both frustrating and hopeful. It is frustrating that Sarah had to go through this, that she had to expend energy fighting discrimination when her job was to run a hospital. It is frustrating that she had to document, prove, and fight for a right that should have been obvious. But there is hope in the fact that she brought about change. There is hope that an imperfect system eventually responded. There is hope that one person with knowledge and determination can move an institution. And there is hope that the people who come after her will have better protections. We must find a balance between the two, acknowledging that systems are broken while believing they can be fixed, understanding that individuals shouldn't have to be heroes just to be treated fairly, while applauding those who stand up anyway. The hallway outside the ICU at Street Mary's looks the same as it did that Wednesday: the same walls, the same lights, the same nursing station. But something fundamental has changed. There is a clear message in the air: you cannot judge a person's right to be here by their appearance. You cannot enforce rules selectively based on race. And if you try, there will be consequences. David learned that lesson the hard way, as did the security firm and the hospital. Hopefully, everyone else can learn it too. Rights only matter if someone is willing to defend them. Policies only work if they are enforced fairly. And change only happens when someone is willing to fight for it. If you ever find yourself being treated like an outsider in a place you have every right to be, remember that you have choices. Document everything, know your rights, and hold your ground. Do not be afraid to demand accountability. It isn't being difficult. It is demanding the basic respect that every human being deserves. Only then can we create a world where a person is judged by their character and competence, rather than the bias of someone else's eyes.